There's a problem with Webflow grids. Let's set this heading to span 9 columns and paragraph to span 3, and we'll reuse this layout on other pages but with different content. Notice if we change the design of our layout in the future, it only updates this one instance, because these settings are applied to the individual element and not the class. Systems that use Flexbox to create grid layouts have the same issue. Design changes had to be manually applied for each instance of the layout throughout each page of our site. Also, when using Flexbox, we can set an individual item to span across multiple columns, but we can't set the item to span across multiple rows. When using Flex, extra divs are required called column to set the padding between items instead of having our element directly within the list. Ultimately, CSS Grid is the better tool for creating grid layouts. One feature that may seem to save the native grid is grid areas. If we hit the plus sign, we can create an area, choose the number of columns we want it to span, and call this area our heading area. Then we can go ahead and create another area here, span over 4 columns, and call it our paragraph area. Now, once those areas are set, we can start adding some content into our grid. By doing this, we have to select our content and choose the area we want to link it to. And this is only linked to the individual element. This area is not being set on the class. Meaning if we create this layout using these same classes, we may have to relink it to the area we want it on. Now, if we go ahead and duplicate this though, and we decide to edit our areas here, notice how it's editing every instance of this in real time. Now, the catch here is we have to know how many items we're going to have within our grid, and we can't reuse this 12 column for other types of layouts. It's specific to this one layout. In Lumos, my new framework for Webflow, there's a layout system built specifically to solve these issues. This system uses one class for any grid layouts throughout our site to keep our code light and clean. This is 12 columns, which is default in most designs, but it can easily be changed to accommodate any number of columns that a design was built on. This 12 column class stays 12 columns on every single breakpoint, and we just adjust the number of columns and rows that we want each item to span to make them larger or smaller using these classes. To see this in action, let's apply these classes to create a layout. So on this header wrap here, we're going to add in the class name a GD12 for our 12 column grid, and notice it sets this class to a display of grid and sets the children inside to span all 12 columns. We'll want to change their width on different breakpoints, and Lumos follows a mobile-first approach, meaning sizes cascade up, but not down. So if we set a column width on landscape, that'll go for tablet and desktop, unless we choose to override it on a different breakpoint. And the same goes for our rows. So we can do CP for column portrait, CL for column landscape, CT for column tablet, and CD for column desktop. And we can set sizes 1 through 12 for our number of columns. So here on this header left, let's head over to the tablet breakpoint and let's add a CT for column tablet and set it to 8 columns. So when we go below tablet, it's back to the 12 column default. And when we're at tablet or above, it's going to be the 8 columns. Now here on desktop, we're going to set a CD for column desktop and we'll set it to 9 columns. So it widens up a little bit. And then here we have this header right. So here on tablet, we're going to set a CT of 4 columns. And then here on desktop, we'll want to make that a little bit smaller. So we'll set a CD of 3 columns. And now that we have those set, it works on every breakpoint. And when we go below tablet, they're both back to being the full 12. So if we have multiple instances of this header layout throughout our site and we change the design in the future, it's going to update across all of them site-wide. Also on the header wrap, we can affect things like alignment, and this is only affecting the header wraps throughout our site, while this grid utility keeps things like gap value and column count consistent across all grids site-wide. Next, let's apply a layout to this blog list. So with the blog list selected, in the class name, we'll add GD12 to apply our 12 column grid utility. And we're fine with these items spanning all 12 columns on portrait, but on the landscape breakpoint, we'll want them to span 6 columns instead, so we have a 50-50 split. We can set our column widths on the items like we've been doing, or we could apply it directly to the grid itself. So we can set column landscape to span 6 columns, and that means all items in this grid will span 6 columns regardless of the class we apply to these items. And these 6 columns is cascading up all the way through desktop. But on tablet breakpoint, we'll want to change the layout yet again. So we'll do a column tablet and we'll set this to span 4 columns for each of the items inside this grid. Then when we head to desktop, we want to adjust the layout one more time. So on desktop, we'll do a column desktop of 3 columns, and each item within the grid now spans 3 columns. The settings we applied to the grid are the default sizes for items within the grid, but we can always override it on individual items. So for this first item here, let's give it a combo class of isPrimary, and let's set it to a column desktop of 6, so it spans across 6 columns on the desktop breakpoint. While we're at it, let's set it to a row desktop of 3, so it spans across 3 rows here on desktop. Now when we head to the next breakpoint down, those styles are gone because they only cascade up, meaning this item is now inheriting from the default styles applied to the entire grid. But we can continue to override this if we'd like by setting a column tablet of 8, so it spans across 8 columns on tablet, and let's set a row tablet of 2, so it spans across 2 rows on our tablet breakpoint. Now there may be some other items we want to change, like if we select this item here, let's give it a class of isSecondary, and let's set this to a column desktop of 6, so it spans the 6 columns, and let's set it to a row desktop of 2, so it spans across 2 rows. And then the styles on the secondary are automatically cleared out when we head to the next breakpoint on down. If we head to our layout embed, we'll notice that our 12-column utility has a column gap and row gap of our size1 variable from our spacing embed. So if we change this to size 2, this would change it to 2 rem instead, and it would update every 12-column grid throughout our whole site, keeping our items aligned with each other. Now we could always change or override this. So on this individual header wrap, maybe we want the gap vertical to be 4 rem so that when these items stack under each other, they're spaced a little bit further apart. So we can override this freely on each grid, but the default gap is set from the embed. Lastly, let's say our design was built on a 10-column grid instead. We'll copy this and create a new grid. We'll call this grid 10, and we'll change this to GD10 for our utility. And we're going to set all items within this grid to span 10 columns by default, and the grid itself will consist of 10 columns like so. And then we can use all the same sort of utilities to set column width on portrait to 10 through 1. We could delete 11 through 12 if we're not using them, but since the style guide is using them, I'll leave them in place. So now we have a 10-column grid. We could easily switch this to GD10 and start building sites on a 10-column grid. So that wraps up an overview of how to use the Lumos layout system. Clone the style guide in the description below to get started with Lumos, and check out this next video on using Lumos.